We don't hire con artists, son. "5 years. You figure I can't do the math? Out." A whole room, staring at the floor. Nobody stood up. He had 6 weeks to find out. I wonder how that man's face looked when he finally knew the truth.
You saw how it ended. Résumé on the floor, a guard at the door, a kid walking out with a dented tin in his fist. What you didn't get was the part that actually cut, and it landed a breath before anyone said, "Get out." Calder is a one-plant town, and the plant is Halstead Motorworks. Nobody in Calder crosses that name and expects to keep working in Calder. So when the ad in the window said minimum 5 years experience and a 22-year-old walked in to answer it, the interview only ran one direction, and it ran there fast. It wasn't the con artist line that stung. It was the one that came after Isaiah told him where the 5 years came from. 13 years old, his grandfather's shop out on the county road, engined since before he could drive to them. That was when Gordon Halstead's eyes went slow, up from the twice-resoled boots, over the mended coat, to the young black face, and back down, taking inventory. "People like you always grew up around cars," he said. Easily, almost gently, the way a man remarks on the weather. "This is a precision floor, son, not a chop shop on the wrong end of some county road." He didn't hear an insult in it. In his own head, he was defending a standard. And the rest of the room, the woman frozen at the keyboard, the foreman with a fist around the wrench in his pocket, the older man waiting his turn with a cap in his hands, heard every word and found somewhere else to look. Look, that's the part that stays with you, not the shove, the quiet. A whole room agreeing, without saying a thing, that a man already knew exactly what you were. Except he didn't. Nobody in that office had the first idea who Isaiah Boone actually was. And to understand that, you have to go back, all the way to a burn on a 13-year-old's hand. The 5 years were real. They just didn't look the way Gordon Halstead expected experience to look. Isaiah Boone was 13 the first time he stood at a bench that mattered. Boone Engine Works sat on the county road east of Calder, cinder block, one bay. A hand-lettered tin sign his grandfather had bolted over the door back when the shop still had more work than ours. Odell Boone ran it alone. 70 years old, hands like cracked harness leather, and he did not teach the way anybody teaches now. The first afternoon, Isaiah reached across a manifold that had been idling 20 minutes earlier. The heat took the skin off 2 knuckles before he understood he'd been burned. He didn't cry out. He was too surprised, and Odell didn't rush him to the tap. "Now you'll remember," the old man said. He was right. Isaiah still carries that scar, a pale seam across the back of his right hand, the first mark the work ever left on him. Not the last, but the first. Then Odell taught him the thing the schools skip. He held a scrap of steel up to the light and made the boy read it. The straw gold, the blue, the dull gray. Read the color the heat had left in the metal, and tell him how hot it had gotten and how fast it let go of that heat. Made him feel the way fluid wanted to move through a passage before he'd let him touch a gauge. Metal first, numbers later. A machine can't lie to your hand, Odell told him more than once. People lie. Metal doesn't know how. Boone Engine Works died slow, and it didn't die of bad work. Odell's work was the best in the county. Everyone who brought him a dead engine and drove it home said so. It died of a name getting bigger down the road. Halstead Motorworks bought the small shops one at a time, took the fleet accounts on price, and waited. When the accounts went, the shops went with them. Odell locked the bay for the last time the year Isaiah turned 16. He didn't curse the man who'd done it. He pried the old tin sign off the door, pressed it into the boy's hands, chipped, rust eating half the letters, and told him to keep it. "Go learn the thing they never let me learn," he said. "Then it's yours anyway." So Isaiah went. State school, mechanical engineering, top of every list they kept. And he carried something into the lab the other students didn't have. A cinderblock shop's stubborn horse sense, the habit of reading metal by hand. In his final year, he went after a question the field had shrugged off for a decade, a geometry in the way fuel enters the chamber, an approach the journals had dismissed years back as too crude, too backwater to bother modeling. The country cousin of a real idea. Isaiah modeled it anyway, because Odell had taught him that the smartest people in the room are the ones most comfortable ignoring what actually works. A cleaner burn at full load. The kind of result that lets a heavy engine hold the new emissions line without surrendering power. He filed the patent the spring he graduated. His advisor, Dr. Miriam Osei, co-signed the work. His name went on first. He cut the first working injector himself on a manual lathe, the slow way, the way the old man would have wanted it done. It lived in a felt-lined tin in his coat pocket, and stamped along its body was a serial number. One that matched, digit for digit, a production drawing he had authored with his own hand. He did not need a job at Halstead Motorworks. He needed something harder to get. To stand inside a real line while it ran, to see with his own eyes how a plant that size actually breathed. Before he decided which of the companies circling his patent would ever be allowed to license it. He hadn't picked one yet. That was the whole reason he'd come to Calder. He just hadn't planned on the folding chair. Isaiah didn't drive home. He drove out the county road to the shop that wasn't a shop anymore. The padlock had rusted into one solid lump, useless. But he knew where the spare lived, under the third block from the corner of the slab, where Odell had kept it for 40 years and never once been robbed, because there was nothing out there worth the drive. He let himself in through the side door. He didn't linger over any of it, the dead lifts or the drums gone orange with rot. He'd already made his peace with this room. He came for the drawer. Under the workbench, in a deep steel drawer that stuck on the runner, Odell had kept the customer ledgers. Cloth-bound books, a decade of them, entries in the old man's small square hand. Nobody had opened them since the last account walked. Isaiah sat on an overturned bucket, propped his phone against a vise for light, and read. He wasn't reading for memory. He was reading for a pattern. The names came off the pages in order. The trucking outfits, the county fleets, the 2 quarries, and beside each one, the year it left. He'd half known the shape of it his whole life. Now he could see it drawn. Every account that had walked out of Boone Engine Works had walked the same direction. Down the road to Halstead, who took them on price and kept them there. For 30 years the arithmetic had run one way. Halstead swallowed the small shops, ran cheap, and got comfortable. And then, this year, something had cracked the comfort. Isaiah had been following the plant the way you follow a chart on a patient you used to know. You don't post a 5 years minimum ad, turn away every warm body that answers it, and burn a candidate in 4 minutes, not unless you're drowning and too proud to say the word out loud. A comfortable man doesn't hire in a panic. A panicking man doesn't insult the help he's begging for. Gordon Halstead was doing both at once, and the only way both were true was if the contempt was an old habit and the fear was brand new. He closed the ledger. He wanted to know what the fear was. It took an afternoon. County library, a trade press archive, a public filing anybody could pull. 2 months back, Halstead Motorworks had put its name to a preliminary supply agreement. Engines by the 1,000 for a national fleet buyer. The kind of contract that doesn't just save a plant. It saves a town. The diner, the mortgages, the school levy, all of it. And buried in the announcement, in the flat language of a press release, was the condition every engine maker in the country was sweating that year. The units had to meet the new emissions line, at rated power, on the buyer's clock. Isaiah read that sentence twice, and the second time, he stopped moving. He knew that clock. He knew that power band down to the number. He had spent a year of his life living inside that exact corner of the problem, and he knew, the way you know the sound of your own name, that there was no honest road to that standard, at that output. in that window. Not with any hardware a company could order. Not with anything sitting in the open literature. Everyone in the field had run at the wall and bounced off it. There was one geometry that got over the wall. He had drawn it, on a manual lathe. In a cinder block shop his grandfather had bolted a tin sign over, and his was the only name on the paper. Nah. Sit in that for a second. A man throws your work on the floor, calls you a fraud. Has you walked out like a stray dog in front of a whole room, and the entire time, the only reason his doors open in the morning is a thing you built with your bare hands. What do you do with that? Do you kick the door down, or do you get very, very quiet? Isaiah got quiet. Because he needed to be sure, and there's a difference between lab saw and floor saw. A number can be right on a screen and still be wrong in the metal. 2 weeks after the interview, Halstead Motorworks threw its fall open house. The tour and hire day, the plant ran every autumn to look like a neighbor. And Isaiah put on a clean shirt and walked in through the same front doors nobody had thrown him out of yet. They kept the visitors penned in the demo hall, a velvet rope between the public and the line, a row of cutaway engines up on stands, a coffee urn, a banner with the Halstead name in 8-foot letters. Families drifted through. A couple of guys in ties handed out brochures. Isaiah stopped at the rope in front of a display block and looked at it the way other people in the room were looking at their phones. He didn't need to touch it. The injector tip told him the story from 3 feet away. He read the soot, the color baked onto the nozzle, the way it feathered on one side and starved on the other. A spray throwing fuel where fuel shouldn't go. He'd read 1,000 nozzles exactly like it, standing on a milk crate beside Odell before his feet reached the floor. The color said the same thing this time it always said. Wrong angle, wrong wetting. A problem that lived upstream in the injection where no amount of fiddling downstream would ever reach it. You see something? The man had come up on his shoulder without Isaiah noticing. Coveralls, grey at the temples, a laminated badge that said Floor Supervisor, and, under that, a name, Petrisco, F. Frank Petrisco had run that floor for 20 years, sat in the technical meetings, and signed off on what shipped and what didn't. He didn't ask the question like a host. He asked it the way a man asks who's been losing sleep to the same gremlin for a week, and can't stand the sight of it anymore. Isaiah told him. Nodded at the nozzle, told him what the color meant, told him the fault was in the injection. The spray angle, the chamber wetting, and that his people were probably chasing it downstream where it would never be, because that's where the gauges pointed, and gauges don't know how to read a burn. Told him where to actually look. Frank Petrisco didn't say thank you. His eyes went to the kid's hands. The grey worked into the creases of clean fingers, the pale seam riding across 2 knuckles, and then to the small dented tin the kid kept turning over in his palm, the way another man might worry a coin. He didn't ask about it. He filed it. He filed the hands, the tin, the diagnosis a room full of degreed engineers hadn't reached in 8 days. What's your name, son? Isaiah told him that too. Then he walked back out the front doors on his own 2 feet, and this time nobody's boot touched anything of his. He was careful, in the days after, about a line he would not cross, and later, when it mattered to everyone in a glass room on the top floor, it would matter that he'd held it. He never went near a locked door. No badged-off hallway, no drawing he wasn't handed, no file that wasn't already public. What he had wasn't stolen. It was arithmetic and a fingerprint. The arithmetic was simple enough to say in one breath. The standard Halstead had promised that fleet buyer could be met one way. That way was patented, and the name on the patent was his. So either Halstead had licensed the geometry, quietly, off the books, from somebody, or Halstead was building on it with no signature at all. There was no third door, and Isaiah had never signed a thing. He couldn't prove the inside of the plant from the outside. He knew that. The hard proof, the internal drawings, the demo files, the paper that would turn a certainty into a finding, lived behind doors he wouldn't open, but he knew exactly who was allowed to open them. He called Dr. Osi. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always had when a student called after dark. He told her what he'd found in the filing and what he'd read off a cold engine at a rope line, and then he did something he'd never done for anyone. He opened the tin, set the injector on a clean white cloth under good light, and photographed the serial stamped along its flank. He sent her the picture. On her end, he heard her chair turn, heard her pull the drawing registry, heard the small silence of a person matching a number against a number. When she spoke, she'd stopped being his advisor and started being something with more weight behind it. "You know what this is," she said. "Not a question. I know what week it is." Their board sat Thursday, he told her, to sign the fleet deal. He gave her the room, the hour, the date. She had standing he didn't, the standing to demand an audit and be answered. She would need to know exactly when to walk in. For the first time since the folding chair, someone else knew what Isaiah Boone was going to do. He spent the next stretch of days building a file instead of a case. A licensing packet, clean and dated. A demand letter. The patent grant, the registry match, the photograph, every page squared to every other page. He told no one else. He didn't call a reporter, didn't post a word, didn't drive past the plant to look at it. A younger man would have wanted the scene, the shouting, the finger, the camera. Isaiah wanted the paper in the room before he ever set foot in it. 3 weeks went by like that. Quiet weeks. The kind where nothing happens that a neighbor could see, and everything happens. On the Wednesday night before the board met, he drove back out to the shop with no power and sat at Odell's bench one more time, under the tin sign gone half to rust. He laid the injector back in its felt bed. He turned the tin once in his palm, thumb finding the dent on the lid, and closed it. It was the same motion he'd made in a folding chair the day he was thrown out. It meant something different now. The Halstead boardroom sat on the top floor, glass on 2 sides, and through it you could see the whole plant laid out below. The roofline, the stacks, the lot full of cars belonging to people whose mortgages ran through this room. 11 directors around a long table. A fleet buyer's counsel patched in on the speakerphone, a small red light blinking with him. And in front of Gordon Halstead, turned to the last page, the contract that would save all of it, with a fountain pen already uncapped beside it. Doctor, Miriam Osei was not on the agenda. She came in behind the coffee cart before anyone thought to stop a woman in a grey suit carrying a thin aluminum case, and she did not ask whether she could. She set the case flat on the table, squared it to the edge with 2 fingers, a small, exact motion, the habit of someone who has learned to let the objects talk so she doesn't have to. Then she opened it. She laid down 3 things, spaced apart like a dealer showing a hand. A patent grant, cover page up, 1 name printed first. A licensing audit, tabbed and flagged along the margin, open to the page where a production line had been built on a design no one in the building had ever signed for. And a felt-lined tin, which she opened with her thumb, and turned so the number stamped along the little injector inside faced the table. For a moment, nobody in the room understood what they were looking at. Gordon Halstead's hand moved on its own, reaching for the pen he'd uncapped, then stopping short, fingers closing on nothing. For 30 years his signature had ended every argument that ever happened in this building. His hand hovered over the page, and for once didn't come down. The director nearest the case, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, picked up the patent grant. She read the first name on it. Her eyes moved to the young man standing at the back of the room, whom no one had bothered to introduce, and then back to the page, and something went out of her face, and something else came into it. She passed the sheet to the man beside her without a word. He read it too. It went around the table like that, hand to hand, and the temperature of the room changed with it. On the speakerphone, the buyer's counsel asked what the holdup was. The red light blinked. No one answered him. Osei let the quiet stretch until it had done the work no speech could have done. Only then did she say the single thing she had flown in to say. "You've been building your rescue on a license you never signed." She reached down and capped her fountain pen with a small click. "The name on it isn't mine. She pulled out an empty chair against the wall, sat, and folded her hands in her lap. She was finished. She would let the paper finish the rest. It was a director, not Halstead, who sent someone down to the floor for Frank Petrisco. He came up in his coveralls, a shop rag still hanging out of his back pocket, and he wiped his hands on it out of pure habit before he stood in front of 11 people who signed the checks. They asked him plainly, was there anything to the kid's claim, or was this a stunt? Frank didn't make a speech. He wasn't built for one. He told them his engineers had been chasing a fault on a demo block for 8 days with every gauge they owned. He told them a young man had stood at the open house rope, looked at a cold engine for about a minute, and named the cause, the injection, the spray, the wetting, and told them where to look. He told them they'd looked there. He told them the kid was right. Then he added the only thing that was his to add, and he said it looking at the table, not at Halstead. He'd hired and fired men on that floor for 20 years, and he knew the difference between a man who had read about engines and a man the engines had raised. He stepped back against the wall next to the woman with the aluminum case, and said nothing else. It cost Osi to be standing there. She had spent 30 years in a field small enough that names travel it like weather, and she knew, better than anyone in that glass room, that lighting Gordon Halstead on fire in front of his own board would ride into every meeting she walked into for the rest of her career. Old colleagues would remember whose side she'd stood on. Doors would close that she couldn't see closing. She had set the case down anyway. What happened in that room over the next hour happened in order. One layer at a time, and each one sat heavier on the table than the last. The first was the simplest, because it was physical, and physical things don't argue. The board's own counsel, a careful man who'd said maybe 6 words all morning, took the little injector out of its felt bed, set it beside his laptop, and pulled up the production drawing off the plant's own server. He read the serial off the metal. He read the serial off the screen. He did it twice, because the room had gone quiet enough that everyone heard him do it. Same number. Then he opened the audit to its flagged pages and walked the line backward for them, out loud, unhurried. From the engines rolling off the floor that week, to the geometry machined into every one of them, to the date that geometry had first entered the Halstead process. The audit didn't accuse anybody. It didn't have to. It just laid the timeline down and let the timeline do it. The design had gone into production, and it had gone in without a license behind it. The second layer took the first insult and turned it inside out. Somewhere in the packet, tabbed and waiting, was the résumé Gordon Halstead had thrown at a young man's chest 6 weeks earlier, the one Dana Reyes hadn't fed to the shredder that morning. She'd stood over the machine with it, and then she hadn't. She'd slid it into a folder instead, because a 4-minute interview and a boy walked out by a guard had left a taste in her mouth she couldn't rinse. That folder was in the room now. And stapled behind the résumé was the thing the résumé had been telling the truth about all along. A transcript, top of the program, honors on the line. A granted patent with a filing date and a name printed first. The con artist, the kid who couldn't do math, set beside the actual work histories of half the people drawing a Halstead paycheck on that floor. His 5 years weren't the lie in the room. They were the one thing in the building nobody could pad, borrow, or fake. The third layer was money, and money is loudest when it's read out loud. The director with the beaded chain did the reading, because someone had to, and her voice was steady in the way people go steady when the number is too big to editorialize. The fleet agreement, she said, was worth north of $200 million over its term. She let that sit. The share of the plant's forward orders that hung on meeting the emissions line, and therefore on the one geometry that met it, she put at better than 70%. She let that sit too. The back royalties already owed. On units built and shipped without a signature, she read off the last page of the audit, just over 19 million. A man across the table asked her to say that figure again. She said it again. And the timetable, she finished, was the part with no give in it at all. There was no other engineering road to that standard, at that power, inside the buyer's window. None. You licensed the geometry from the man who held it, or the contract walked and the plant walked with it. She set the page down. 6 weeks to the day, from a folding chair on a concrete floor to that number on that table. And then the last layer, the one that had been lying underneath all the others the whole time, waiting for someone to lift it. Isaiah Boone had not said a word since he walked in. He'd stood at the back through all of it, turning the tin over in his palm, letting the paper and the people do the talking the way he'd planned it. Now he came forward. He set the tin down on the table, and beside it he laid one more thing he'd carried in, a rectangle of old sheet metal, paint chipped to the primer, half the letters eaten away by 40 years of rust. You could still read what it said, Boone Engine Works. That was my grandfather's shop, he said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. Out on the county road. You took the fleet accounts out from under it when I was a boy, on price, and you waited for it to close. It closed. Nobody moved. The geometry your whole contract is built on, the thing keeping every light in this building on. I worked it out on his bench, with his tools, in the shop. He looked at Gordon Halstead then, straight on, for the first time since the folding chair, and he handed the man back his own words. Quiet, flat, without a single degree of heat in them. People like me always grew up around cars. Gordon Halstead's hand came up off the blotter. The signet ring came down, twice. It was the last time anyone at that table would ever watch him do it. The chair was already calling the vote, and Halstead's hand hadn't finished its second tap before the count had started around the room. A show of hands. Quick, almost gentle. The way a thing ends when everyone already knows how it ends. Stop. Let that one land all the way. The kid he called a fraud. The one he had marched out of the building like a stray. That kid owns the only thing keeping the lights on over every head in that room. So when it came time to decide what he was, who do you think stared at the floor now? Not one of them. And that's before we get to what it did to the man behind the desk. The vote didn't take long. They didn't send him out in handcuffs. Nobody read him rights. This wasn't that kind of room. And the word fraud never once got said out loud by anybody with the standing to make it stick that day. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. A motion, a second, a count of hands from people he'd handpicked. His name came off the letterhead by the authority of his own board, in his own boardroom, at a table he'd built. The pen he'd uncapped an hour earlier to save the company was still lying there, uncapped, having signed nothing at all. The board voted before lunch. By Friday, Gordon Halstead's name was off the office door, though it stayed up on the building, 40 feet of it in steel, because you don't unbolt a name that size in an afternoon, and the people left standing had more urgent things to bolt down first. The fleet deal didn't die. It froze. The buyer's counsel came off the speakerphone and into a conference room 3 days later and said it in language nobody could misread. Not one engine ships under this contract until the license behind it is real and signed. So the plant kept its doors open the only way left to it, by sitting down, at last, across a table from the man it had walked out a guard's length past 6 weeks before, and negotiating for the right to keep building the thing it had already been building. The full audit OC had opened, ran its course over the months that followed. It found what the first pass had found, only in more detail than anyone wanted. Back royalties on every unit already built and shipped, a running rate on every unit to come, and one line, buried in the signed preliminary agreement, where Gordon Halstead had personally put his name to a warranty that the technology was the company's own to sell. That line stopped being the company's problem and became his. It followed him into the civil suits the fleet buyer filed, and into the ones his own shareholders filed after that. He didn't go to prison. He went to depositions, and then to a smaller house across the county line, and then to a phone that had simply stopped ringing, which, for a man whose whole life had been the sound of that phone, was its own kind of sentence. Isaiah could have finished the plant off. Through the entity that held the patent, he had the leverage to name any number he wanted, and every person in that boardroom had watched him understand it. He didn't. He licensed the geometry to Halstead Motorworks, kept the line running, kept 1,400 Calder paychecks attached to 1,400 kitchen tables on his terms. And one of his terms went onto the first page of the agreement. In plain language, a lawyer would never have chosen on his own. The 5 years minimum requirement came down. It came down because once people started pulling that particular thread, the whole garment came apart. Cross-checked against who'd been granted interviews and who'd been walked to the door, the experience bar and 3 other quiet little rules had never really been about experience at all. They'd been a sieve, a way to keep the floor looking the way one man believed a precision floor ought to look, and to do the sorting so cleanly that no one ever had to say out loud who was being sorted out. Too young, too new, the wrong end of the county road, the wrong face in the doorway. The rules said the words so the men never had to. The new notice in the window ran 2 lines. It said the plant would train. They called the program the Boone Apprenticeship. Odell's name, mounted over the door of the place that had spent 20 years quietly erasing it. The first morning it opened, Vernon Tate walked in, the man who'd sat turning his flannel cap to felt in that interview room, who under the old rules would have been sorted out before he finished the application. Beside him came a 19-year-old girl from 2 streets over who'd have been a full year short of everything the old ad demanded. Frank Petrisco met them at the door with 2 folded sets of coveralls and not one word of ceremony, and walked them out onto the floor himself. The same floor a young man had read a cold engine on from behind a rope. Odell Boone was too weak by then to stand for long. They drove him in anyway, and somebody found him a chair. In the lobby, behind glass, they'd mounted the old tin sign next to the little injector, and above the 2 of them, cut into steel and lit from below, 2 names, Boone, his, and the boys. He looked at it a long time and said nothing. He'd never been a man who needed to. Down on the floor below him, the line ran, and every engine that came off it carried the shop with it. Walk the Calder floor today, and you'll find that injector everywhere. The geometry a 13-year-old first read in the color of hot steel, that a young man drew on a dead shop's bench, it's stamped now into every engine that rolls off the Halstead line. The same small part that once rang against a concrete floor and got nudged back with the toe of a guard's boot. One original sits in the lobby, behind glass, in its felt bed, under 2 names in lit steel. Isaiah still carries the tin. Some afternoons he opens it, thumb finding the same dent on the lid, and turns the injector over. And the pale seam across his knuckles, the first mark the work ever left on him. 13 years old, a hot manifold. A burn an old man told him he'd remember, catches the light against the metal it finally became. The first thing the trade ever took from him, resting on the last thing it gave. Gordon Halstead used to stand when he threw a man out, so his shadow would land first. In the end, he was the one walked to the door, by people who'd once cashed his checks, and the kid he'd called a stray decides now who comes through it. He called him a con artist. Turned out to be the only real credential in the building. Here's what stays with me. There's someone where you work, on your street, at your own table, that a whole room has already made up its mind about. Too young, too broke, too far from the right end of the road. Doesn't belong on the precision floor. And the one thing you're so sure they can't do might be the exact thing holding the roof up over your head. So tell me in the comments, who's the person your whole building stares at the floor for? Say their name, even just to yourself, before you scroll. If this one landed, send it to somebody who needs it. And hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because the stories about the people we throw out don't get told near enough. Somebody built the thing you're leaning on right now with their 2 hands. You just never read the name on it.